And that's probably what failing at the Olympics taught me, is that until you get exposed to under that pressure and that intensity, then you don't know whether your plan will stand up to those testing times. So, yeah, it was a hard lesson to learn, but one that I think has probably held us in good stead.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Working in Sport podcast. We have a very special guest today joining us. He is the current head of athletic performance for the Australian Women's Sevens program. He was a former rugby union player himself, playing a lot of rugby down with New South Wales Waratahs primarily. He was an S&C across cricket and rugby union. Tom Carter, thanks for joining, mate.
Thanks very much for having me, James. Really appreciate it.
Mate, the journey from athlete to coach is an interesting one. Obviously, you've gone on that journey. As an athlete, did you ever sort of aspire to think one day you would be a coach leading a program?
No, definitely not. I think I probably always loved the game. And I think when you're sort of transitioning out, you're trying to think of, what roles do you want to do? And probably having spent a lot of time being a professional sports person, you probably... the last thing you think is you're going to go on coaching it. You're sort of quite happy I guess an aspect of you is quite happy when it's all over, that you can go on to another version of your life. But I've ended up back here, and I sort of originally wanted to sort of go into a corporate health business when I retired, sort of early in sort of 2010, 11, 12. But, got back into one-on-one coaching and then got back into sporting teams. And, probably, love it and enjoy it immensely. And probably something that I feel quite familiar with because I've been in and around it for a while now. So, it's something that you never, I guess, plan to be in these positions, but certainly enjoying it.
Was there something that you took from some of the coaches that you might have had during your time as a player and you went, geez, I need to do that when I coach my athletes?
Yeah, I think ultimately you sort of the coaches that I suppose developed relationships with you and built belief in you, I think was probably, first and foremost. And then, tactical and technical and, I guess, your cultural or psychological stuff that goes on within programs, you pick up little nuances along the way. But I've sort of said it before, I think there's a lot of really good coaches out there, but there's probably one or two things that differentiate between a winning and losing season, and that ultimately determines whether the coach has longevity or stays in a role. So that was probably the big thing for me was, you've got to be able to be well planned and organised enough, but have a vision to try and stay ahead of the game, and then being able to execute that with the group you've got and manage certain things. Obviously, we're managing a pandemic, or we've just come out of managing a global pandemic, so that had its challenges. And they were probably the little things that I was able to pick up along the way around, what were the keys to being an effective or for a good coach. But certainly underpinning it was probably being able to develop a really good relationship or rapport with people.
So once you started making that transition as a coach, you were working in a few programs in and around Sydney across cricket and rugby. What was that transition like? Were there any, were there any sort of maybe teething pains or just things that you needed to manage, like no longer an athlete now, I'm a coach, I need to behave like this or act like this, or I can't be doing these things? Was that quite challenging to make that transition, or would you consider it quite seamless?
No, definitely challenging. I think there's probably two things. When you first come out of professional sport, you probably think your idea of how you view the world is very different, and it's probably skewed. You probably think you have a little bit more answers, and then as you get a little bit older and you develop life experience and you study a little bit more, you realise you have less answers. And then as you keep getting older, and now I'm nearly 10 years out, post-retirement, I probably realise I've got very little or very few answers. And so you have that confirmation bias as a player that you think that you can relate that to your coaching methodologies. That's probably one. And then the other one is just your relationships with people. Sometimes you've played with them and or you've, got a close affinity to them, so they have a perception of you as who you are as a coach. And then that just takes time, or as a consequence of time, being able to develop your own ideologies away from a player. And this is how I view the game, or this is how I think things should be done. When you coach. So that pedagogy, I suppose. So, yeah, those two things were probably the hardest, particularly around, how I played the game of rugby versus how I probably wanted to coach it or drive it, were probably two of the big things that, in the rugby example, were probably two of the big things that I probably had to spend time working on, and were the biggest areas that were just going to take time. So, yeah, I think, you're never a good coach. I don't think, first year out, you can always, you develop your emotional intelligence, your maturity, and how you manage situations, and probably you make lots of mistakes, particularly in the athletic performance world, around how you load players, or, your ideology around how you want the game to be played. You probably get caught in, I'm just going to apply the same model to every place I go to, or it takes a little bit of, I guess, wisdom or reflection to be able to come back and think, well, maybe I should have applied something different in that situation. So, yeah, I think hopefully I don't think, in the next 10 years I'll be as good as I will be at 50. So, hopefully at 50 I'll be a little bit better than I was at 40. And then if I'm still coaching at 60, hopefully I'll be better than when I was at 50, I think. And that's probably where, my passion lies for is that each year and week you're trying to be a little bit better, or every day really you're trying to be better than you were yesterday.
I'm interested in what you're saying about the transitions from this is how I thought as a player and this is how I thought as a coach, and this is how people perceive me as a player, and now I need to change that perception, and they got to think of me a little bit differently as a coach for me to actually be able to coach them properly. Can you share an example or a time where that was very, very obvious to you that I need to change this perception that I have, or I need to change this perception that a player has of me for this thing to actually work?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, I was probably not the most physically talented or skillfully talented player, but I had a really good mentality around hard work and work ethic. And I think instilling that belief in others is really, it's a great challenge, and it obviously does influence how successful you could be, because ultimately you look at the great sporting teams, there is an element of that the group's been able to work incredibly hard, or work really hard for a long period of time to get better. And then obviously when they get better, they're able to execute their skills and perform better. So obviously the psychology or reasoning behind that, but how you execute, that's really important. And not every person has the same drive or same belief that you may have, particularly in an amateur or semi-professional environment, pushing or driving people to go to places that perhaps you think is right, or your vision is right. And whether they're willing to go there with you is really challenging, and probably managing that difference, I think, between expectations and perceptions, and then reality. Probably there's those three. So, everyone wants to, I used the analogy the other day. Everyone wants to grow up playing. Who plays cricket wants to wear the baggy green, but the reality of wanting to wear the baggy green versus being able to do it, and then the practice required, and then I suppose the element of performance required at the various levels, and there's significant degrees of variance within that. And so that was probably the big thing for me, is like, okay, this is how I think the game of rugby should be prepared for. This is the standard. This is the level of intensity required. And I think that was very much of a shock for a lot of people, and particularly, when you're applying it and you've had success as a player doing it, that methodology, you probably think it'll work for you as a coach. So you think, well, this is what I'm going to do because I know it works. But ultimately, you've got to be able to apply it to the group. And so I talk a lot about sort of genotype and phenotype. And I know they sound like big words, but it's more like what's the genetic capability of the group, or what is their capacity to tolerate training load or intensity, and then what's their environment? Where do they, how do they view the game? How much does it mean to them? What are their aspirations? And then I suppose, what is their skill level capability? And then I sort of really do try and think a lot about that. And then that probably measures or shapes my coaching methodology and practices first. So certainly people and environment first, and then I guess, what is required to achieve success with that group. And, Tim Walsh, the current women's sevens coach, has been really influential around challenging some of my thinking around that, and been really, really incredible insights to, you can understand why they had success in 2016 in Rio. And he's been, brilliant to work with in that regard.
Those few things that you're looking at for your players to really understand where they're coming from, and ultimately to inform your ability to coach them and make them better. Is that a moving target? I can imagine something like that would almost be moving week to week, day to day. How do you manage that?
Yeah, look, it's it's probably never more pertinent than the group we've had here. Obviously, we're defending Olympic gold medalists leading into Tokyo, and then from Rio, and then obviously the Olympics got changed due to the pandemic, got put back a year, and so managing disappointment, emotions, expectations around, and I suppose leveling degrees of motivation. Can we go on for another year? And so I don't certainly think it's sort of binary or fixed. I think absolutely it's a moving target. And I think that that's probably the art to the great coaches is when to provide that stability of, I know today wasn't a good day, or you might be struggling with motivation, but hey, like this is the long-term goal. Let's chip away at that. And or other people where it's time to say, well, look, we probably need to really push now, and we need to find some real purpose in what you're trying to achieve, and I guess that vision and goal. And so I think that whole goal setting piece is so important. It's like the reality is, yes, the performance on the weekend's incredible. If you're a Test cricketer in front of a crowd, or a sevens tournament, our girls play 6 tournaments a year, obviously a few more this year with the World Cup and Commonwealth Games, but being able to provide, I suppose, insight into, how do you maintain that motivation or drive and purpose to be better? And, on the other side of that, the truly great people that I've been involved with coaching-wise, or I've been fortunate enough to be coaching-wise, people like Brad Haddon or Nathan Lyon, Bronte Campbell, their drive and purpose is quite incredible. And then that's what sets them apart, is their ability to turn up day upon day. And there's this misdemeanor which the rest of the world sometimes forgets, is they don't feel good all the time. They're often struggling with those, levels of fatigue or motivation, but they still find an ability to try and get better every day and seek to be better every day. And whilst they might not always achieve that, they certainly do that more often than not, and that allows them then to get that consistency of sustained performance. So, yeah, absolutely, as a coach, that's what probably sets you apart. And look, I don't have all the answers. I'm sitting here openly saying that I probably have made more mistakes than made good decisions. But I think from those mistakes, you reflect and think, well, if I can get 300 good training days out of 365 in a year, and can keep them fit and healthy, and enjoyment's high, and motivation levels are certainly trajectorying in the right way, then I think that you're on your way to achieving more success than not.
So you alluded to it before. You had a gold medal winning team coming out of 2016, rolling into what was supposed to be a 2020 Olympics, and obviously got moved into 2021. There was a disappointing result for that group at the Olympics in Tokyo. Would you say that was a real focus for the team to be able to gather themselves and bounce back following those unfortunate results? Was that one of the key philosophies that you yourself were implementing as a coach, was just trying to get them to, realize the purpose and the goal, and try to get back on the horse for the next, series of competitions and things that they had to focus on following the Olympics?
Yeah, I mean, I think losing doesn't have many positives, obviously, except for the fact that it probably just sharpens your lens around, as a coach, around things that you, behaviours and, I guess, performance parameters that you want to drive, and I guess others that you don't want to see exist. And that was probably the biggest thing post Tokyo. There was a real clear element that we felt, in order for this group to become successful again. I mean, look, they'd always set the program up. There was a lot of young talent emerging, but obviously the I guess, merging or crossover of when the older players who'd won gold and done such an incredible job in setting this program up, and the legacy was shifting towards the back end of the career, and less giving the younger players enough time and experience to be able to be better footballers. There was always going to be a period of time where that was obviously, going to take a little bit longer. But I think post the Olympic Games, from my mind, particularly from a physical perspective, I was really clear around what we needed to do better, and probably adjusted my thoughts around what this group was required to do. And that was probably the best thing from my end. I think I became really, really clear around, this is what we need to do to be the best sevens team in the world, and that's how we're going to approach our pre-season and train. I'm sure the girls will laugh and say about, reflecting on how hard or how challenging it was at times, but I felt like we were just really clear in our purpose around how we wanted to train and how we wanted to physically prepare the group for the demands of sevens. Now, look, we've had a little bit of success, but we haven't probably had as we're not satisfied with that. We want to keep going and we want to keep building and keep having sustained success. So, as I touched upon earlier, that we're sort of 2/3 of the way through a season with some significantly, important tournaments coming up. So we still need to be able to manage that. But at the backbone of us, particularly internally, there's some real clear focus around sort of behaviours and language and performance parameters that we're going to continually drive towards, because we think, or we know, that leads this group to having success. And that's probably what failing at the Olympics taught me, is that until you can have the world's best plan, but until you get playing competition or playing, until you get exposed to under that pressure and that intensity, then you don't know whether your plan will stand up to those testing times. So yeah, it was a hard lesson to learn, but one that I think's probably held us in good stead.
We've spoken about a few of the great coaches that you've worked with or worked under, and you've mentioned a lot about group culture, behaviours, and manifesting a good mindset within the group. What is that relationship like with the head coach and the other coaches when developing the team philosophy? And as someone who's leading the physical performance program, where do you know where the line is? Like there's elements where you, let's say you're observing training, you may or may not want to step in because that's the coach's time, or you may or may not want to step in other areas because that's someone else's time that they have with them. How do you as a group manage that? Okay, we have a common vision of this is the philosophy and the behaviors we want to drive from the team, but also this is their training session, so I can't step in. How does that dynamic work, and how do you sort out that sweet balance?
Yeah, look, I've been fortunate to work with, some really good coaches, and I think the great coaches know when to get that balance right. So when it's, coaching, technical, tactical side, or when it's physical development, or whether it's integrated, and you've got to be really well planned. I think you got to have a vision of where you want the group to go, and that probably allows you then to develop your language and behaviours. So, everyone on the coaching staff's pretty clear of what's required for us to get to that outcome or get to that vision, and then within that, everyone knows their roles and responsibilities. I think from my end, and even though I played the game, I sort of don't try and get involved in any of the tactical or technical coaching stuff too much, because ultimately, I think it's important for players that they have the clarity of messaging, and that's really important. And then second of all, if the coach was to ask me to help out, I'll be more than willing to. But, from my end, I think I played, as I said, a lot of rugby. And if I reflected on my own career, I didn't spend enough time practicing skills within context of the game and practicing skills within the context of training environments. I just was always very much focused, which is ironic, focused on the outcome of getting picked or getting selected and winning. And I think whilst that had a little bit of success, I think turning up every week and being a better footballer or being a better player every day then sort of almost takes care of the weekend. So I learned that from when I went into cricket, just looking at how hard they worked at their skills. So back to that comment is that a training session is an opportunity for a coach to coach skill and tactical and technical development. Yes, there's opportunities for physical development to be integrated into that, and I can obviously try and work on some of those, speed or running qualities, but I don't see it as my place there to be shaping the nature of training. I've absolutely got to prescribe loads, and, we've got to make sure that we have a good injury profile. But for me, the more opportunity players get to make decisions at training under the context of the rugby environment and I guess the game model and how we're trying to play the game, the better off we're going to be. And that's might be a little bit controversial and left of field, but I don't think it's my job to sit there and tell the coach how to coach. It's to support him unequivocally to be able to get the group to where we need to get to from a football perspective.
So this group, it's sitting down before the season and saying, okay, these are the behaviours we want to manifest from the group. Is that led from the head coach, or is this some sort of communal discussion that you're all having? How does that work? How is that set up and sort of going, okay, this is our plan, we're going to go on with X, Y, Z?
Walsh does a brilliant job of it here. Like, we'll sit down with all staff, so, all medical, physio, S&Cs, data, coaches, and work out, and this is how our group wants to look, and this is what we want to try and achieve. And then, absolutely getting involved, senior players and understanding, explaining, this is the vision that we've got and this is how we need to try and go, and this is the direction we want to go in. So, no, it's absolutely collaborative and integrative, because otherwise, if people don't buy into it, it doesn't become their vision. It just becomes your vision, and then you're driving it. It's this top-down approach, and I don't think that works. I think that ultimately our job is to make ourselves redundant as coaches. Ultimately, it really is. And that's a big statement. But you look at the great sporting teams that have had success, and I think that's what they've had. They've had a group of core senior players that have been able to drive this group of language and behaviours, and then as a coach, you're just there as a true coach, that's to guide and mentor and provide a framework where you can be there to give feedback or help technically coach them, but almost you're just a beacon shaping them in the right direction to make sure they stay on task. And I think that's really what really good sporting teams and organisations do. And you've got to provide energy, as we just touched upon earlier, energy on the days that they're really flat. Maybe, when the other days where they're a little bit off with their language or their behaviours, you've probably got to chip them and make sure that they're on task. But I think that's what great systems and organisations are able to create is when you have a collective buy-in and everyone's on the same page, and then ultimately the athletes and players are shaping the narrative of where that program wants to go.
I had the pleasure of coming down for a week with the Australian Rugby Sevens program and spending some time there as an intern and working with you. It was fun to watch you in the gym. It was interesting to observe your behaviours in the gym. Not that you knew that I was watching you too closely, but you, as a coach, you seemed like you had a real presence in that environment. But you also had this approachability for the girls to come up and be able to speak with you. It was very evident that you have a great relationship with the group. We've spoken a little bit about the performance elements of coaching. You've mentioned load and skill acquisition and money technique and things like that. Majority of what you've spoken about so far has been culture. I'm going to ask an open question. What are some of the more important traits that you think a good head of performance coach needs to have when dealing with their athletes?
I definitely think probably emotional intelligence is the most important thing. And I think a level of reason. I think you need to be able to manage them fairly, but also firmly, so that they know that you stand for something. I think you've got to have your own firm beliefs around some non-negotiables around that it's okay to have a bad day or be struggling, but ultimately these are sort of my expectations or standards of behaviours around what I expect. And then I think, no one's growth is just linear. I think people mature or develop at different rates. So being understanding and accommodating of that as well, particularly in light of COVID and what people have been exposed to and variances in training loads, that, hopefully over time there'll be, a little bit of balancing out or averaging out of that. But I think for me is to build trust and a connection with people. So therefore then, sevens is a brutal sport. It's definitely the hardest sport I've worked with or certainly played in as well. And so, being able to create some stability and support in those frameworks is so important, particularly in the female athlete, and allow them to feel safe to develop and fail as well. Like ultimately that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to push them to the edge, not over the edge, but you're trying to push them to the edge often and challenge them. So I think they've got to have trust in you and have a relationship with you where they can, say, I'm really struggling today, or I need some help, or, today wasn't my best day, and not be feared that they're going to be judged by that. And, I said to them at the end of the Olympics, I remember how disappointing it was, particularly for the old and younger players. And I just said to them, I remember, I really just hope that just sparks something deep inside you to really pursue to be the greatest, version or footballer of yourself. And, there's this big disconnect often. People think just because you're a professional player and you're getting paid, it doesn't equate to being an elite athlete. An elite athlete to me embodies the Olympic spirit. And I think the best thing I've seen out of, I suppose, that result was that some of our group are really seeking to be elite athletes. And that's something as a coach that you can be really proud of, that some of our behaviours have changed and people have grown up and, they really are trying to push some limits. And that's really, I have no doubt with the talent in our group that success will follow, but being able to push that type of elite professionalism and behaviours is something that makes me proud as a coach to be a part of. So we might not get the results this year, but we certainly, obviously, we've had a few. But I think over time, if we can continue down that path, we'll get a lot of success because the group's more than talented enough.
What was your motivation for pursuing a PhD as a coach?
Continuing education and challenging. I think I've always had the question. I think when I was little, my parents would say, I always asked why and what if. And I just think, particularly in the sports science industry, there's so many fads and so many trends out there. But that scientific inquiry of asking why, like, you know, and if this is current in modern practices, could I apply it to my group? If not, why not? But particularly around the female sporting space, I don't think their stories have been told enough. I think, obviously, particularly in Australia, professional female athletes has only just started to emerge, probably over the last decade or so. And I think they deserve their story to be told. And I think practitioners, you know, it's definitely a totally different space to managing male athletes, whilst there are some similarities and things that are totally different. That I think it's really important that the more research we can delve into, you know, you can look at the current injuries often in AFLW or women's football around ACLs, and how do we help, developmental athletes, younger female athletes, sort of reduce those injury incidences or injury risks, and then how do we, maximise their longevity in their careers as well, particularly in a speed power sport like rugby sevens, where it's so demanding on the body musculoskeletally. So yeah, that was probably the passion or reason behind it. I've still got a little bit of a way to go, but I've really enjoyed it from a coaching perspective, that it's challenged some of the thoughts or biases that I had. As I alluded to earlier, when you come out as a professional player, you have a view of how things should be done. And ironically, I probably sit at the other end of the spectrum now around so many of those things. So, there's so many good S&Cs out there, and they might not get an opportunity to coach at this level, or they might not think they're doing a good job. But a lot of people do a really good job. But then there's probably a couple of things where that separates them from being good to great, or not so good. So I guess that also helps people when eventually you complete it, to give back to the industry and help other people shape or mould their views. I think that's probably the underlying reason for
it. To wrap up, I wouldn't mind getting your take on a young coach starting their journey, and what advice you would give them. Now, you have a different background, given the fact that you've come from professional sport. Some might consider it a leg up, some might consider it a hindrance. I wouldn't mind your take on that as well. But what would be your advice to a young coach who's starting out in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the first question regarding, I think having played the game, it gives you a good insight to, you probably can form your own views of what worked for you and what didn't work for you. So I think that is an advantage, because you then probably can relate to. And I think you touched upon it before around, do I cross over, or how do I know my role? Well, I think I learned that from a young age, that I spent a lot of time doing pre-seasons because I never played for the Wallabies. And I felt like each year was different. And each year was almost like starting again, rather than adding value to me as a player through skill or physically. So I always felt like that. I think you want to add layers, because if you have an extended period of time doing something and getting better incrementally, then you end up in a pretty good position. So that probably was an insight that I was able to, use as a benefit. Obviously, playing rugby for so long, I feel quite comfortable working in this space. So I think that's an advantage. I guess the downside of that is that I wish I started my career earlier. I'm late 30s now, and you've got a young family, so travelling on the road and being away from them is really hard. So, which ties into my point of any recommendation to a younger S&C, is that I wish I started a little bit earlier, because I love it, but I wish I did it for longer. So, I've only got 10 years experience. I wish I had 15 or 20. But for a young person, I just think two things, continuing education, like always seeking different knowledges, and that doesn't necessarily be a uni degree. That might be going to seminars, and that might be, going to continuing, courses or those type of things. So we're always sort of trying to challenge yourself. You should never think you're arrived as a coach. And then the other one is just coaching. Like, coaching, volunteer coaching, signing up to coach. You know, I at the back end of my rugby career, I started working in Sydney Uni Cricket Club with Gary Whittaker, and I was coaching their club and ended up being chairman of selectors, but then started coaching, you know, Sean, Abbott and Nathan and Brad, and got into the Sixers. But I'd coached cricket for 10 years. And I think the more you coach, the more mistakes you make, and the more mistakes you make, the more you learn. And I think that's the key. I think you don't want to arrive in a job and think, God, you know, I haven't actually seen this, I haven't been exposed to this, and then you've got to make decisions, and you might, you know, everyone makes the wrong decision, and that's not a bad thing. But I think the more you coach, the more decisions you make, and then therefore you're obviously over consequence of time probably going to make more wrong ones, or you learn some things and that you can transfer with you the rest of your career. So you know, you don't become a good coach or a good practitioner overnight. And I'm not sitting here on this podcast thinking I'm a good one either, but you certainly get better as you go on, and the more you do it. So you know, it is heads of performance roles on a 9 to 5 job either. You know, there's an enormous amount of hours, you know, we've discussed offline around data and how you plan, and then there's obviously the face-to-face coaching. So there's so many, and then managing different stakeholders within the program, and managing coaches, and then managing athletes. So I think the big thing for this is it's so multifaceted, and you know, the biggest thing is time. You've got to be able to give yourself time to all of those people. And that's the greatest gift you can give someone. But I think if you're a little bit younger, maybe you have a little bit more time. And that's probably, you know, my one piece of advice. If you want to be involved in elite sport, is immerse yourself in it through coaching and spending time around those clubs, and being willing to do a long apprenticeship. It certainly helps you. So, yeah, maybe some people felt like I skipped the queue a little bit because I played rugby or I was played professional sport. But you know, it has its advantages, and obviously, you know, as I just touched on, might have had some disadvantages.
Well, you paid your dues, mate. In another way, that's for sure, mate.
Yeah.
Your passion for coaching radiates.
I can feel it. You're a critical thinker, like a very deep thinker. I can tell that just from the time that we've spent each other, and the time that I know you. I know that you're thinking about not just the physical outputs, but also deeply thinking about those philosophies around coaching and things like that. It's very admirable. Mate, enjoy your time in the Great White North in Canada. Best of luck, and thanks for coming on.
No, thanks very much. I really appreciate you for having me. Thank you.
All right, if you enjoyed that chat with Tom Carter, you can click and watch some of our other conversations up here. If you want to subscribe to the channel, you can click down here. For Tom, I'm James. Enjoy the rest of your day.